Hello, everyone. Welcome to our conversation with Dr. Raymond Tallis here at the Houston Center for Humanity Common Good. I'm the director of the center. My name is Jens Zimmermann, professor of theology here at Regent College. And I'm joined, of course, with Dr. Raymond Tallis, who's professor emeritus of medicine at the University of Manchester, and with Professor Robert Doede, who is professor of philosophy at Trinity Western University in Langley, Canada. We're very, very pleased to have this conversation with Dr. Tallis, and we will jump right in and begin with questions. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for having me.
Very gracious of you to travel here.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.
So we'll just fire away.
All right. Raymond, can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, your parents, the influences they may have had on your thinking, your career trajectory, and maybe a little bit about what you were like as a child.
Gosh, that's a big one. One can sort of rationally reconstruct one's past from what little I remember. I suppose you could describe my memoirs as amnesia lane, because one remembers so little. But I guess I was quite a sort of timid child, rather thin, very anxious, very earnest, desperate to please, and so on and so forth. It was interesting that I didn't really have much, as it were, concern about religious issues when I was young. Probably because my father was a Protestant, my mother was a Catholic. They got married in the Protestant church, and that was the end of any discussion of religion, really, because clearly there was not going to be a sort of meeting of minds. My main concern as a child and youngster was to be academically successful. It's interesting, my father hoped I'd become a mathematician. He thought that was really the serious business. But I decided, for reasons that I can't quite remember, to become a biochemist. And somebody told me you can't become a biochemist, and a really successful biochemist, unless you get a medical degree first, which was probably a good thing, because I was no good at biochemistry. I was not safe with molecules, and so it was okay to treat people. So I did medicine at Oxford, and really medicine has dominated, or did dominate my life for nearly 40 years. But prompted by knowing this conversation was coming up, I was thinking about my relationship to religion. I would very much like to think that I didn't, quote, believe in God because I'd thought it all through and looked at the arguments and told St. Anselm he'd got it wrong, etc., etc. But actually it wasn't like that. Nor was it because I'd done some kind of utilitarian calculus, saying that if you look at the impact of history, of religion on history, that it was largely negative. One can't make that calculus, of course not. We can't run history twice with and without religion. And anyway, there are many religions and many dimensions to religions. So I guess my lack of relationship to religion and my sort of instinctive secularity was mainly due to a sort of the lack of a God-shaped hole in my consciousness. Yeah.
Good.
And so when did you, on your webpage, you say that you're an atheist humanist. Like so you distance yourself in that sort of sense from, let's say, Christian humanism or some kind of religious humanism. When did you make that sort of move consciously?
I guess my starting position was a humanist one, although perhaps I wouldn't have called it at the time. Right. I used to call myself an atheist and then decided it was rather a negative definition of oneself. To be defined by what you don't believe in seemed to me to be a rather negative definition. It dawned on me, I suppose, in my teens, 20s and early 30s, that humanism really lacked a serious philosophy. Or rather, it thought it had a serious philosophy. That is to say, it was almost as if it was good enough for it to be rude about religion. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a strange way of being a humanist, is to be rude about religion, given that religion has been so absolutely central to the history of humanity. So what a strange sort of human it is to be a scorched earth humanist like Richard Dawkins, for example. But I was terribly aware that others around me who were humanists felt that the only alternative to a supernatural account of humanity would be an entirely naturalistic one. That really, to see us as just pieces of nature I knew that was wrong because we're very, very different from pretty well everything else in the natural world. So there was the need, as it were, to create a humanist philosophy that wasn't merely negative about religion and uncritically positive about scientific naturalism. And I suppose that's something that sort of dawned on me over time.
Yeah. In fact, I remember that's part of the reason I was attracted to your work, because you don't need, you're against the reductionistic accounts of what it means to be human on either side, really. And so I'm just wondering. I remember in your book, Seeing Ourselves, I think it is. There's some sections on there where you actually talk about what religion has interesting to say about being human, what science can't show us. So that's very interesting to me as a theologian, obviously. Do you have like, when you think about these things, is there sort of one, there probably isn't, but do you have like a knockdown argument where you think, okay, that's why I will not explore, religion or Christianity further, because there's such a long tradition in Christian theology on what it means to be a person. Personalist philosophers are often Christians, as you know, or at least come from that spectrum.
Yes.
So when your mind goes there, like where do you stop? Where do you say, well, no?
Well, I mean, in many ways, most of the arguments, if I was to have to mobilize arguments against religion, they would be the sort of arguments that a fourth former would understand, like the sort of questions such as, God created everything, so who created God? That sort of thing. The notion of a first cause clearly doesn't stand up. But then I have to say that scientific accounts of the of creation are lacking in any kind of validity. I mean, the favorite one is that instability in the quantum vacuum produces more matter than antimatter. And actually, when you look at it closely, it looks more like a creative accounting story than a creation story. I mean, so I guess I've never strongly argued with myself about these things. That wasn't my path to humanism, i.e. arguing against religion. And it seems to me, of course, there is much in religion that is truly admirable. And there's much, obviously, this is a cause for concern. So in a way, it was not so much no to religion as a sense, a desire to encounter oneself and to see the richness and depth of humanity. Right. And its extraordinary difference even from our nearest primate kin, chimps and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you have over 30 books out, and this may be a hard question to answer, but what book would you say is the most important book you published?
Oh, thank you for saying most important, implying the others are important as well. That's
yes,
really nice.
Indeed.
It's difficult to say because obviously I've written in different genres, fiction, poetry, essays, books about individual philosophers, Parmenides and Heidegger and so on. So there's no one book that gathers up everything that I would like to say. And in fact, in many ways, much of my writing has been a quarrel of the genre. There's no fully satisfactory genre. I mean, philosophy, for example, gives you a synoptic view or attempts a synoptic view, but the price of seeing everything is to overlook everything, to see past everything. Poetry, you can focus on something very, very particular and hope to unpeel it with your gaze and so on, but it doesn't have that synoptic view. Mm-hmm. So, I guess Aping Mankind, which Jens has already mentioned, is one that I would be delighted if people read. The most recent iteration of my humanist belief, namely Seeing Ourselves. Again, it's an attempt to create a genuine humanist philosophy.
Yeah. I want to end this sort of more biographical segment here by asking you, I often tell my students, what our reading obviously shapes us, like what we read shapes our outlook. And I know one often cannot point to one single book, but between the books that you've read and your experience as a medical doctor, what and how have these things shaped you to the place where that you've been thinking about defending the human person, defending human identity, to have a robust, non-reductive sense of who we are as human beings?
That's interesting, but just to, we obviously learn from books, but Lord Acton once said that we should learn as much from writing books as from reading them, and I think the very process of writing things has done as much to change my thought as reading other people's books. As for picking out those books that have been most influential, well, I was on a program called Desert Island Discs once, and I was asked to choose the book I would take to me to the desert island. And it was Heidegger's Being and Time. I disapprove of lots of aspects of Heidegger, but he's a good person to quarrel with, and one can quarrel with him endlessly in the most fertile way. But as to which books have influenced me most, I had a strange experience a little while back. I took down from the shelf my copy of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and the spine was all fizzy and broken. There was hardly a page that hadn't been underlined with NB, NB, NB all in the margin, but I cannot remember reading it, you know. And so in many ways, we don't have a clear idea of those books that influence. There's a lot of input that, as it were, adds up to some kind of intellectual humus. Yeah, I have to say, if I was going to choose my Desert Island Disc book now, it would be James Joyce's Ulysses. And I would strongly recommend it.
Why would you say that?
It is, I think, the only book that captures the multiplicity, the multidimensionality, and the richness of everyday life and ordinary consciousness. It is just unbelievably brilliant. Yeah. So I haven't answered your question at all, really, but probably because I genuinely don't know the answer.
Well, I'll take great comfort in that answer, because just the other day I pulled out a book just like that. I thought this is interesting. I've always wanted to read that, and I found my pencil notes all over it. So while we're on your books, let me start that we talk about your ideas a little bit more focused. In many of your books, you criticize evolutionary scientific theories because they reduce human beings to their composite parts. And you commonly criticize what you delightfully call neuromania and Darwinitis. Briefly, so I wanted to know, what do you mean by these terms, and when did this limitation of the natural sciences sort of first hit you? I mean, you are a medical man. Obviously you love science, but when did this sort of arise in you that, yeah, this is a limited way of looking at what it means to be human? Like, was there any particular moment in your clinical activity? Was there anything that kind of when you went, yeah?
I can remember my infinitely patient tutor at Oxford when I was a student there, and we argued endlessly. He was a physiologist about the nature of vision and whether vision was identical with activity in the visual cortex. So it was pretty early on that I felt that we didn't have a neuroscientific explanation of many aspects of ourselves, not even the basic aspects such as consciousness. And I think it's important to distinguish between, as it were, hostility to neuromania, which I'll explain in a second, on the one hand, and hostility to Darwinitis, which I'll also explain, and basically a support for neuroscience. All my research was in neuroscience, so I have no problem with neuroscience. And likewise, Darwin's theory, it has become ever more incontestable as time goes by. There are technologies and discoveries and methodologies that he had no inkling of when he published Origin of Species 170 years ago, and yet his theory looks stronger in the light of them. Carbon dating, genetics, genomics, continental drift, you name it, all of those have strengthened the theory of evolution. So my problem is, of course, not with neuroscience, nor is it with Darwinism. It is with pathological forms or pathological uses of these extraordinary biological sciences. So neuromania is the belief that we are to be understood as, in some sense, identical to what's going on in our brain. So if we want to understand Jens, what we do is we peer into his intracranial darkness and look at what's going on when he's enjoying music or listening to somebody or understanding somebody and so on and so forth. That's the mistake. The mistake is the notion that consciousness at all its levels is identical with neural activity. Of course, neural activity is necessary for consciousness. I mean, if you chop my head off, my IQ falls quite significantly. And it's important to recognize the role of the nervous system, of the brain, as a necessary condition of personhood, of our being the kind of creatures that we are. But it isn't a sufficient condition. And when I talk to audiences about this, I sort of try and illustrate the difference between a necessary and sufficient condition. And here's an example. In order to be knocked down by a tram in Vancouver, I'd have to be in Vancouver. So it's a necessary condition. Luckily, it is not a sufficient condition. But being in Vancouver doesn't guarantee I'll be knocked down by a tram, otherwise I wouldn't be talking to you. So basically, neuromania, no. Neuroscience, yes. Difference in neuromania and neuroscience is neuroscience identifies the necessary conditions of consciousness and all the manifestations of our personality, or some of the manifestations of our personality, whereas neuromania claims that what happens in the brain is the sufficient condition of personhood and so on.
And on the Darwin side, what?
Absolutely. So Darwin, I have absolutely no doubt that Darwin's theory explains how the organism Homo sapiens came into being. Where it fails is to give an adequate account of how the person, such as Bob, Jens, and myself, our nature of personhood. It doesn't explain personhood. So for people who suffer from Darwinitis, they believe that Darwin can explain not only the emergence of centipedes, but the emergence of Mozart, and so on and so forth. And in fact, there is a huge distance between that which can be biologically explained and that for which we need other kinds of explanation.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. A fellow author and scientist from the UK, Ian McGilchrist, he just put out a massive 2 volumes over here. I don't know if it's originally issued that way. But I was wondering, since I know you're familiar with his work, if you could kind of give us a brief summary of his most important ideas, and then situate your own perspective in terms of what McGilchrist offers.
Well, thank you. Ian McGilchrist and I have often met and argued in the most gentlemanly way. Ian's idea, essentially, and it was first expressed in a book called The Master and His Emissary, was that to understand the way civilization is going and the kinds of creatures we're becoming, you have to look to the fact we have 2 hemispheres. The brain has 2 hemispheres. There is the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And in his original book, 2008-ish, he said that essentially the right hemisphere should have been the master, and the left hemisphere should have been merely the emissary. But what happened was the emissary got out of control, and now it's the left hemisphere that is the master. And as far as he's concerned, the left hemisphere is a rather undesirable sort of creature. It's very narrow, it's very confident, it has linear attention, it rather tends to simplify things, it doesn't have a all-round global awareness, it focuses very narrowly and so on.
It's a bureaucrat.
A bureaucrat, absolutely, and that in many ways, I'm sure Ian would accept that the increasing bureaucratization of our civilization is a result of the domination of the left hemisphere. And the worst thing about the left hemisphere is it's completely unaware of its own limitations. It's a bit like Toad of Toad Hall. It knows everything and won't be told anything. Well, I've often, our conversation with Ian, I've often teased him because in many ways I say, so we've got 2 hemispheres. Do you have a third hemisphere from which you can then judge and compare the 2 and criticize the left hemisphere and, boost the right hemisphere? And of course we don't. So where is he looking at his hemispheres from? Well, he's looking at them, of course, from the community of minds, which is where we are really situated. We're not, as it were, confined to the intracranial darkness, as it were, the victims of an unequal battle between our left hemisphere and our right hemisphere. We belong, to use Donald Davidson's phrase, to a community of minds. And certainly if we were, as Ian McGilchrist describes us, really were enthralled to the left hemisphere, then we certainly wouldn't be in a position to see what a naughty creature this hemisphere is and how damaging it is to our evolution. And it's curious in many ways that Ian's critique of reductionism, which he sees as a left hemisphere fault, is itself very reductionist. It is neuromania of sorts. And if anybody's interested, the matter with things is a very fat successor to The Master in His Emissary. It is no less than 1,500 pages long, smallish print, very wide margins with lots of notes. And I had the pleasure of reviewing Ian's book for the literary review. And it was quite interesting because towards the end, and this is confidential, I started skipping a little bit. And so by page 1300, I was jumping a little bit. And I thought, okay, round about 1300, I jumped right to the very end. And it was, I forgot, an epilogue or something. And there was Ian waiting for me with folded arms saying, aha, people who think they're going to get the summary of my view in this epilogue, I'm afraid we're not going to get it, because you can really only understand my view if you read all the pages en route. So I felt very chastened. But it's a book with which I disagree, and but Ian and I have disagreed for a long time. Yeah.
I just wonder, the follow-up question. In fact, I asked this question to Ian himself on Zoom. It seems to me that he's guilty of what you would call transferring of epithets to these to the two hemispheres,
yes.
Where the left hemisphere believes it knows what's right. The right hemisphere has all kinds of psychological predicates ascribed to it.
Absolutely.
Would you say that that's a fundamental kind of sleight of hand in making this a more plausible model, or is this acceptable as a kind of metaphorical crutch alone, and therefore?
I entirely accept that point. I mean, basically, if you want to brainify the person, you personify the brain. Mm-hmm. So you describe the brain in all sorts of terms. You say it deals with messages, it handles information, it has an attitude of this sort, it has an attitude like that. All of these things are appropriate for persons. But if you want to reduce a person to a brain, then you describe brains in these kind of personifying terms. And I think that's a fault that's not unique to Ian.
No.
I think it's pretty well pandemic throughout the whole of, as it were, neurological reductionism, neurophilosophy, neuromania, and so on. Yeah. It's a way, it enables you to cross the mind-brain barrier without doing any work. Right. Yeah.
And so this transference of epithets, I notice similar things when we computerize, how we talk about human beings. We technologize our language about human beings. So have you found, what language then do we use? What's the best language to use to talk about the human person that's non-reductive?
Well, I mean, Bob referred to metaphors, and of course metaphors are a very noble way of handling things, but as long as we're aware they're metaphors and are not to be taken literally. So, of course, when you're talking about how the nervous system works, you can talk about signals, messengers, detection, prediction, all of those things that really humans do, as long as you don't take them literally. Yeah. I mean, yes. Because
I do know, I have friends who work in various disciplines, and there's a tendency to very quickly talk about, how our cells or how even molecules communicate.
Absolutely.
And then, one has to define what that means. And if you don't, they very quickly rush to the fact that, there's a cellular language. Well, the exchange of signals to me is not language. Then your philosophy of language is off, I would say. But anyway, but you haven't found the magic. It's just awareness of how you use terminology.
Absolutely, yeah. and the inappropriate literalization of metaphors. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems that causation goes by so many different elaborate names in these disciplines, where representation is a very common one, where we have certain configurations of neural firing, and this represents something out in the world.
Can I respond to that? Because it's one I'm really fond of criticizing, actually, because you cannot have a representation without a presentation. And it seems to me, if you saw the nervous system, as it were, generating representations of what is out there, you have to say, well, how did it become a representation without actually presentation in the first place? And that's the real mystery. Mm-hmm. But if you talk about representations, then you're already bypassing the central mystery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really important criticism.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well,
so we've talked about the reductionistic views of human nature that we all want to avoid. There's one movement within cognitive science within the last, I'd say maybe 20 years or so, of embodied cognition.
Yeah.
That was its own attempt to sort of, subvert or go against or counter a reductionistic, functionalist account. What's your view on that? And what do you think are the limitations of enactment theory and embodied cognition?
Yes. I mean, one's very grateful that people have discovered the body. Well, revelation, we have a body, so we're not, after all, little computers inside the intracranial darkness, that somehow. So one's grateful for small mercies, that the body is now regarded to be inseparably part of ourselves, and that we are embodied subjects. I'm not too sure, however, that it takes us much further, particularly when there is much talk, for example, embodied cognition. The desire, as it were, to reduce all of cognition to something that can be mapped onto body schemas and so on and so forth. I have a great friend, Jan Halleck, in Prague, who, and every time we meet, we discuss embodied cognition. And one of the things I always challenge with is, what is the body equivalent or bodily representation or bodily embodiment of Paris is the capital of France, the kind of knowledge that guides us through the world. So yes, thank you for discovering the body, inactivists and so on. There is a danger in some inactivism, which we may come back to when we talk about freedom of the will, but because for a lot of inactivists, setting aside a representational theory of the mind, then actually pretty well empty the mind, or seem to empty the mind, of any content that enables one to have some kind of spectatorial distance from the world. And perhaps we might return to that if,
Good. Well, we may as well move to freedom. Crucial to defense of human freedom against the determinism favored by many cognitive scientists still is the notion of intentionality. Mm. And could you briefly explain what you mean, use this a lot, right, in your work, what you mean by intentionality and how this concept serves to overcome the idea popular among many philosophers of the mind that free human agency is merely either a survival-promoting illusion, but an illusion.
Yeah, yes. I mean, the great challenge for those of us who believe in free will, and as a humanist, it's absolutely central to my beliefs in human beings. We're not just sites through which events flow. We are genuinely initiate some events called our actions. To understand that, we have to look very closely at the notion of actions. But also we need to look critically at the idea that every material event is basically has a prior cause, which has a prior cause, and so on and so forth. So that moving my hand now has a whole series of causal ancestors that go right back to the Big Bang. There's also the assumption that any events are, as it were, governed by laws. And I think we need to look critically at that to see how it's possible that we can be genuine points of initiation in the world. That, as St. Augustine said, that man is God invented man in order that there shall be a beginning. And the Enlightenment view that individuals are, or each of us is an individual point of departure. How is that possible? Well, to do that, one needs to look at our consciousness, of course, and to look at critically at the causal theory of consciousness, and particular perception. And we can look at that by looking at something fairly straightforward, like we're looking at Jens at the moment. How can I see him? Well, clearly there's light bouncing off Jens's face, and the light is coming into my retina, tickling up my visual pathways and ending up with activity in the visual cortex. That's the causal story of perception, and that wires our perception into the material world. So it looks pretty forlorn, the hope that perception and the aboutness of perception is going to liberate us in any way from being causally wired into the world. But actually, what I've just described does not explain my awareness of Jens. You can imagine there's an arrow, as it were, of causation leading from the light that's bouncing off his head to the activity in my visual cortex. That's where the causal direction is. But my gaze looks out. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that my gaze is a form of extramission or some sort of counter-causal activity, but it is something that is not captured in the causal network. It is that in virtue of which I'm not causally wired into the world. With human beings, there's something else that's very important, which is the extent to which the intentionality of our consciousness is joined, collectivized, and so on. Out of the trillion cognitive handshakes of shared intentionality arises this extraordinary sphere called the human world. And it's from the human world that we act upon the natural world, from a virtual outside that was initially made possible by the intentionality or aboutness of consciousness, something that is in the opposite direction to causal connectedness. I don't know whether that makes sense.
Right, it does. And just before Bob asks his next question, so your criticism earlier about embodied cognition would be that while embodied cognition may be able to explain a rise of a primitive form of awareness, perhaps, in organic, so it puts us back into organic life forms. It cannot explain, or cannot account for, maybe it's a better way of putting it, precisely that gaze, that viewpoint of a human person to another.
Absolutely. It tries to collapse the distance in many ways. It does collapse the distance. And we need a distance, as it were, of a virtual outside to act upon, act on the natural world, or indeed act within the human world. Yes.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Reading, I believe it was your latest book. I was somewhat surprised by you saying, I can't find it in the book right now, but somewhere you kind of refer to yourself as a compatibilist in your thinking. Maybe you can point the page out sometime. But, and that kind of shocked me because, I have read your work for a couple decades now, and I've felt so kindred spirit. And then all of a sudden, whoa, how does this make sense? And I think I've understood it in terms of your ontological agnosticism. I think that might be one means of accounting for your self-ascription of compatibilism. But I'd like you to riff on that a little bit.
Certainly. It's a strange form of compatibilism. Just to remind ourselves, compatibilism is a position on free will that says free will is compatible with an apparently deterministic universe. And in fact, we need a bit of a deterministic universe to exercise our free will. I mean, the sort of slam dunk for those who are determinists is that basically if, as it were, the universe didn't have utterly reliable habits, and we weren't in some sense causally connected with the world, our actions would not be possible, nor would they have reliable and desirable consequences. So there's quite a problem for those of us who want to acknowledge that condition of rational action without, as it were, feeling we're caught up in a totally deterministic unfolding of things. So the way I, as it were, see free will being compatible with a seemingly deterministic world is to say, well, actually, yes, the world has reliable patterns of unfolding, but we can somehow stand outside of those. And the most spectacular example of that is when we do the very science that seems to some people to show us that we are, as it were, in the grip of determinism. So if you think about some basic science, then let's go to quantum mechanics and all the areas we all pretend to understand, but none of us do. And let's think about something like Boyle in his laboratory, discovering Boyle's law. The law, you may remember, is that pressure and volume are inversely connected. If you increase the pressure, the volume of a gas decreases. and if you decrease the pressure, the volume increases. P over V equals K. What's Boyle doing in the laboratory? Well, he's teasing out elements of nature. He's separating an independent variable, say increasing the pressure, looking at a dependent variable, watching the volume go down, and he's maintaining other background factors such as temperature, maintain them constant. So you can see in the very process that he is, as it were, revealing the habits of nature as the laws of science, he's actually standing outside of nature in order to make it visible in that kind of way. And that standing outside is again a product of shared intentionality. And so if we rethink of the universe as that which has reliably unfolding habits, but those habits through the lens of science can be seen as the laws of science, and those laws are then revealed, manipulated, exploited, etc. That's my form of compatibility. Does that relieve your anxiety, or just press me a little hard on that? Yeah.
See, I found a way to make sense of it in terms of your ontological agnosticism, in that I don't believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that you ultimately believe that science has the ability to give us the one and only true description of the material world. Yeah. And so if the material world has features, properties that we may not even have grasped yet and may never grasp, there may be a possibility for human freedom to arise within whatever kind of material world this ultimately might be, that we may never, have the last word on. React to that.
Yes, I mean, just to pick up at the end and then go back a bit, it seems to me not only do we have the possibility of freedom, because there's absolutely no doubt there really is freedom. There's a difference between me falling down the stairs and me walking down the stairs in order to catch a plane to go to Vancouver to have a conversation with you gentlemen. That's a different kind of thing. Falling down the stairs can be explained entirely in terms of the laws of gravity or whatever you want to invoke. Walking down the stairs for the kind of purposes that I have, which involve tense time and so on, cannot be explained in that kind of way. So I think it's the very peculiar nature of actions and the fact that we stand outside of the world in which we try to actualize possibilities that makes it, as it were, that there isn't a direct conflict then between what is seen through the lens of science and what we know from everyday experience. I mean, I am an ontological agnostic. I'm not a materialist. I'm not a dualist. I'm not an idealist. I'm not a panpsychist. Main thing, I'm not a stuffist. I don't think there's one or two sorts of stuff. I think that's very unhelpful because that then traps you into an unnecessary mess. I mean, okay, some people feel that atoms and chaffinches and cruel comments are all part of the same stuff, whether it's matter or mind or whatever. I don't think that's helpful. I mean, and when it comes to science being a guide to metaphysics, clearly, if there was going to be a guide to metaphysics from science, it would come from physics. And a lot of people confuse the world with the physical world, and they confuse the physical world with the world according to physicists. But if you look at the world according to physicists, it's a total mess. I mean, you think of three rival theories of quantum mechanics, multi-universe, Bohmian hidden variables, the Copenhagen interpretation. They're all completely in conflict, and worse still, quantum mechanics is in conflict with general relativity. So in a way, I don't feel that science is in a position to wag its finger and say, look at me, I will tell you what the world is really made of, what ultimate reality is, and what are the limits of possibility. There's this kind of promissory note. One day we will have a theory of everything, and then everything will become clear, and then you'll discover you're not free or whatever. But at the moment, it looks very unpromising. In fact, physics has got deeper and deeper and deeper into a mess. One of the things that strikes me as a non-physicist is every time you run into a problem, you invent a new particle, a new space, or a new dimension. So in that sense, I'm certainly not looking to science for the answers to the kind of problems that we are concerned about. Yeah.
So this appreciation for science that you have, while pointing out the limitations of science for, furnishing explanations for reality. I love the what you do in a couple of the books is to point to the gap between dynamics of nature, as it were, that we're trying to figure out, and the scientific explanations as theories about what that is. Whereas we tend to collapse the two.
Absolutely.
I think that science gives us just a perfect description of what's going on.
Exactly.
So I think that's a really important critique, and you join others that have critiqued science that way.
Yes. And just to say, by the way, I'm not ungrateful to science.
No.
Thank you, science, for turning the medicine I practiced from basically quackery into something less quacky. So we owe much to science. The fact that I can speak to somebody in Australia without raising my voice, thank you, science. We're in a landscape of artifacts created by quantum mechanics, even though...
I mean, nevertheless, one of the best criticisms of science that I've ever read is by scientists. It's by a scientist by the name of Michael Polanyi. Was a chemist and sociologist of knowledge. And so I just had this question I had to ask you. Every time you made this criticism on science, I went to the index. I said, what the heck is Polanyi in here? So I was wondering, and he has this problem of not being cited. I mean, Thomas Kuhn has a couple of references barely acknowledging that this guy in the 40s did a lot of work on precisely these kind of issues. So I was just wondering.
He came very close to getting a Nobel Prize for chemistry, but my shame is even greater because he was at the University of Manchester. And I haven't read his stuff. And his name was familiar, but I hadn't read his stuff. And when you mentioned it to him, I looked him up and thought, good Lord, he was there in my own hometown. So in that sense, I've got a bit of work to be done there. Yeah.
Just delightful to note you haven't read everything.
Yeah.
Well, here's a question that isn't unrelated to a lot of this. You repudiate emergentism.
Yes.
Yeah, that was another surprise to me. And again, ontological agnosticism made me believe I could see why you would repudiate it. But again, I would like to hear why from the horse's mouth.
Thank you. Yes, yeah. I mean, basically, it seems to me emergence tries to pass itself off as an explanation, but it's that which has to be explained. So to say things emerge, and often people then, they give an example. For example, we know that water is made solely of H2O molecules. Water is slippy and shiny and has a surface tension, but H2O molecules basically don't have these properties. So you can see emergence at work. But I would say no. What you see there is two viewpoints. You see a viewpoint at a microscopic level and a viewpoint at a macroscopic level. Where does those viewpoints come from? They come from us. It's we who can see water in different ways. So it's not as if those molecules do the work of generating the properties of macroscopic water. It's us that sometimes dig down into molecules and sometimes go up to drops of water. So for those reasons, I don't think emergence even begins to explain anything. Yeah.
If I could just interrupt you there. I see that as making sense of like maybe synchronic emergence, emergence in terms of an instance of physical properties and higher level phenomena arising from those as, slippery liquidity from H2O. But what about diachronic? Isn't evolutionary theory a kind of a form of emergence emergence over time rather than at a time, kind of what you were talking about.
Well, that's a good example of basically, yes, I mean, those things happen, but they are what is to be explained rather than the explanation. So the transformation of complex carbon molecules into something as extraordinarily as structured and as dynamic and liquid as a cell, that's precisely what has to be explained, rather than that being an example which can then be used as an explanation. So the passage from inanimate matter to life is not something that's explained, nor from animate matter to, nor from life to conscious life and self-conscious life. I wonder why the word emergence is attractive. And I think it's because it looks like something gradual. And if something happens gradually, it's probably okay because you're still on the same trajectory. So we're sort of reassured that there's nothing new to see here, really. And I say, no, there is something new to see. And just because it's, as it were, that which is new appears slowly, it doesn't make it any less mysterious. Because after all, slowly and fast are terms that are not objective. Scale relative, yeah. I mean, we import scales into the world. That's why we sometimes have atoms. I can't. I'm going to steal that pun. Yeah.
And another question we had, I should let Bob ask you that question because it's his forte, about your use of Sartre, to whom you turn for this notion of radical freedom that we need, right, to disassociate ourselves from, or to take account of our rising above nature. Bob, why don't you ask that question? And
Sartre, being in nothingness is his major work, understands that consciousness is not a thing. It is something that we cannot give any kind of scientific object. That's the nothingness of it, and that's very similar kind of to your understanding of this virtual outside, right? So Sartre says, that the self is free. There's nothing that can cause it to do anything. There's no causal surface to push against, or whatever. But he draws the consequence that if we can get our freedom this way, this entails that we don't have a self, a unified identity over time. For him, the self is really an artifact of theorizing about ourselves, and so it becomes always an object. And as an object, we're out of there. We're no longer that self. And so we can never have this kind of identity that is so precious to humanists and what. And so I'm just asking the question, if you can use his outlook for the freedom element, how can you go forward with the claim that we have identity over time, unified, continuous identity as a self?
Yes. I mean, we've got to separate the early Sartre from the late Sartre.
Okay.
The Sartre being nothingness, I think what you described, I entirely agree. And the self is that which it is not, and is not that which it is, or all of those kinds of paradoxes. But he, in the later Sartre, and I'm much closer to the later Sartre than the earlier one, was the Sartre of critique of dialectical reason and so on. And there he acknowledged that we don't have boundless freedom. In being a nothingness, he says, the fact that I can't climb Mont Blanc because I'm in a wheelchair, he says that's not a limitation of my freedom. It is I who have made Mont Blanc my situation, my project, and so on. So I've freely chosen that project. So I've chosen the thing that I'm limited and able to do. he changed his mind on that, and I'm totally with him, because I don't believe our freedom is boundless. And if it was boundless, it would be empty of content, because you wouldn't have to have a beginning of an action and an end of an action. So our freedom is bounded. Some have suggested that the very fact we haven't chosen the fact that we exist is itself proof we're not free. I didn't, as it were, put Raymond Tallis together in my mother's womb in 1946. But of course you have to have a given. You have to have, in order to have an agenda, for freedom to have meaning, you have to have a starting point. And I think Sartre realised that, although he made the opposite mistake of seeing historical determinism as opposed to absolute freedom. So my freedom is not absolute. And when it comes to the self, again, it seems to me that, first of all, I have unity at a time. I can hear myself talking, feel the pressure of the seat on my bottom, see you chaps, and so on and so forth. But also I'm unity over time, because what I'm doing at the moment makes sense in relation to all the frameworks of our conversation. But also, for example, I feel still responsible for mistakes I made as a junior doctor in the 1970s. There is a tremendous connectedness within myself. And one, it's reinforced properly by others. So when I come into our house, my wife doesn't call the police because she recognises that I'm my husband, not an intruder. When I go to the hospital, I'm expected to do certain things. So we have a tremendous scaffolding, a justified scaffolding of a self at a time and over time. And I don't think Sartre was really very sincere in his view.
Well, I mean, talking about boundedness, we're also bound by time. So I'm just going to drive our agenda forward a little bit. We want to ask you something about meaning, related to meaning and language. And you do connect these two, language and thought, the connection between language and thought. So my question here was simply broadly, whether you could just say something about that. How is language connected to thought? And then my own training was more in a continental tradition, sort of linguisticality, as somebody like Heidegger, Sprachlichkeit, he would talk about that, or Gadamer has follows him in tying that thought and language very closely together, and rooting that in what you call community of minds or historicalness in our traditions and so on. So can you just say something about how you view the connection of language to thought, and if you want, how that relates or not to the kind of Heideggerian Gadamerian account?
It's difficult to know in many ways, which is a very good question, but whether it's an empirical question, whether it's a question of sort of teasing out concepts and so on. It seems to me there are certain thoughts which don't exist until they're fully articulated. So my thought that Paris must be the capital of France, I don't think it's London, that's clearly articulated and it's inseparable from language. But there are other implicit thoughts that are, as it were, partly dissolved in our actions, in our intentions, in our wishes, and so on and so forth. So thoughts don't have to be fully articulated in order to be, as it were, part of the shape and content of one's current consciousness. But the relationship between language and thought, ultimately, clearly articulated thought is seen as the highest level of thought.
But can I just continue with that question of speciesism? I was just really curious because I get this all the time. So when I defend the human person, when I defend the human being as something unique, inevitably you get the question, does not our extolling human uniqueness degrade animals or justify at least our negligent behavior toward dealings with animals?
I don't think it does. I mean, one has to recognize that animals are capable of suffering. That itself will be a sufficient moral imperative not to treat them badly. Of course, we do in many ways use them. I mean, I have a utilitarian attitude towards fish. I mean, I don't eat human beings, but I do eat fish, and I don't mind them being farmed in order to be eaten and so on and so forth. So, yes, we have an instrumentalist attitude towards animals, which would be fundamentally wrong if it was basically replicating our attitude towards human beings. So we can recognize our fundamental difference from animals without drawing one of either of these conclusions. Either that their suffering doesn't matter, it most certainly does matter, or they're machines. Cartesian way, most certainly they're not machines, they are capable of suffering. And the other is, it doesn't mean to say we're better. I suppose I'm probably likely to feel that I'm better than a chimpanzee, but it may well be the case. I'm not willing to go to the stake on that. I just want to emphasize the absolutely fundamental difference between us and our nearest, even our nearest primate kin. And it's worthwhile elaborating perhaps on some of those differences, because that feeds into the argument about the difference between Darwinism and Darwinitis. Between Darwinism, that it gives a good account of the emergence of the organism H. sapiens, but gives a very poor account of what it is to be a person, Raymond Tallis or whatever.
Right. So maybe you can go back, but I'll just add to this, since we're on this person question, which is central to all of your work, right? What's a person? So what do you mean by the term person? And yeah.
In a way, a definition's probably not helpful. It's more, as it were, to look at things that are true of persons that are not true of chimpanzees, trees and stones. So, for example, and when one's looking what's interesting about human personhood as opposed to the animal organism, it's wrong to look at special things and say, well, we're different from chimpanzees because they don't compose symphonies, or we're different from chimpanzees, because they don't retain legal advice when they fall out with other chimpanzees. That's a sort of higher order things. And we can, in a way, the whole of my mission has been to unpack personhood in a way that shows its infinite complexity, whether you can see it in the behavior of our heads, the use of our hands, and so on and so forth. So if I wanted to, as it were, to make visible personhood, I would look at things that we seem to have in common with animals, e.g. something like feeding or learning. Take feeding. There's a total difference between human dining and animal feeding. We dine by appointment. We bring our food from all sorts of places. We have cooking that no animal does. We have very important rituals around feeding. We have tableware. We have, and so on and so forth. All those are totally different from animal feeding. If you look at learning, I mean, the way animals learn, it's basically by largely bumping into things. Animal parents don't teach their young in the way that we do, except in Disney's films. So much of our learning is actually sought out, is structured, is by appointment, and so on and so forth, and it's mediated by knowledge. All of that is completely different from the kind of learning we see in animals. Daisy the cow bumps into an electrified wire, gets a horrible shock in her bottom, and never ever goes by that wire again. Well, she sort of learned something, but that's not the way we learn things.
So, I'm sure you know the philosopher John McMurray. He's one of the first I've read. He makes that claim. I wonder if you would make that claim, that it may be a mistake to follow this path that we've been conditioned in, to view human behavior always in light of animal behavior. Although we share the same nature, but perhaps something happened in the development that's not allowed. So we have to actually. So when a woman is pregnant and the parents prepare the house for the arrival, we call that nesting. But that may just be a really wrong idea of doing it that way.
When you think of what so-called nesting behavior of human, basically the woman rings up the painter and says, look, I'm due to have a baby in 6 weeks' time. Any chance of you fitting me in for painting this room? And then rings up John Lewis in order to get the cot and all the things that you do. Now, none of the way that's all done is totally different from the way it's done in the case.
So I have to ask this because that's out of interest really quickly. Like some of the things that you mentioned, I like the way you said it. So the notion of a person is that you recognize something there, which perhaps in the end defies like a single definition. But it's not simply capacity. It is ways of being that makes us a person. It struck me, even the some things that you said. So I'm somewhat versed in ancient patristic literature. A lot of the things that you've said, right, they come up. The way that we have developed, they would even use that, or say that we have hands the way we use our hands, that we have a voice box, that God has freed our hands from doing the kind of foraging stuff and so on and so forth, so that the voice could develop, that we walk uprightly, so we can speak to one another, watch each other face to face, like all these kind of things. I was just wondering if you've ever wondered about how the compatibility between your forays into what a person is and that focus and the Christian tradition of the human being made in the image of God, which is by no means reducible to rationality, but has all these, relationality, freedom from nature, has all kinds of facets that you also work with, I know.
I'm not familiar with that literature, but I think I'd like to be, because it's very interesting. I mean, the example you've given of the hand, Sherrington beautifully talked about how, when we adopted the upright position, it freed the hand from being a locomotive prop to a delicate explorer of space. And one can tell a just so story, with the hand quite central and vision being central, of how we moved from the conscious state of chimpanzees to the purest state we're in now. And I suspect there are lots of insights from judging what you said, and I'm inspired to have a little rummage, actually, because I think it would be very interesting. It's interesting just to remind ourselves of how different we are from our nearest primate kin. We have tense time and they really don't. We have post-tense time in calendars, diaries, and so on. I mean, this huge distance between us and our kin, and there's a story to be told. I mean, if you think about a chimpanzee 5 million years ago, do you know what the height of their technological achievement was 5 million years ago? It was to use a stone to crack a nut. Oh, and what are they up to now? Oh, they're using a stone to crack a nut. And you can see, meanwhile, the journey we've taken, most of which has accelerated over the last perhaps 300,000, 20,000 years. But it's easy to overlook that huge distance, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question in regard to, your robust commitment to calling science out in its inadequacy.
And not so much science as scientism.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. That's exactly.
Thank you, science, for all the things and so on.
Yes. Exactly. That's important to mark that distinction. But to call out scientistic, simplistic, reductionist approaches to human consciousness is inadequate, in fact, kind of contradictory in some deep, fundamental, and practical ways. Colin McGinn, who's been noted by doesn't matter. As a new Mysterian, right? He too would say that we cannot understand how we have transubstantiated the material into the consciousness of our experience, and in fact, we are cognitively, constitutionally incapable of being able to construct a theory that would make sense of that transubstantiation. And therefore, the failure of all the scientific accounts of that transubstantiation are not evidence against us being just neurological machines, consciousness being identical to neurophysical events, because he believes that is true, and we just can't make sense of that. Right? How would you differentiate yourself from?
Yes, he says roughly the right thing, but definitely the wrong reason. So, I mean, as you say, transubstantiation is exactly the metaphor he uses. How do we get the wine of consciousness out of the water of neural activity? And he says we will never explain it because we are biologically constrained in the sense of the kind of things we can explain. I was thinking, how did you manage to stand outside of your biological constraints in order to see that those constraints would operate in such a way as to be unable to do something as exotic as connecting neural activity with conscious experience? It's a bit like Ian McGilchrist in a way. So that paper of his, 1989, in mind, I mean, he's quite right. We seem to have no way of trying to understand the emergence of consciousness if it does emerge from neural activity.
So we have a couple of more questions, and one of them has to do with freedom of nature. freedom from nature, which is a positive thing, but which can also become sort of a warped focus. And one of the places where that does is in the realm of technology.
Yes.
And so here I wanted to talk to you about this phenomenon of transhumanism, I'm sure, which you've encountered, where, you know, once again, the freedom from nature that we have to contemplate various things is now used to engineer and enhance ourselves out of our bodies into a kind of, disembodied perfection of digitization, consciousness, or whatever. I'm just wondering, I'm sure you've encountered this. You can't be humanist and not heard about transhumanism.
Very much so. Yes.
So what is your view of the phenomenon?
Basically, this is the notion that perhaps we could reinstantiate minds in non-degradable tissue, for example, or replicate them, so that when the computer that is Raymond Tallis is getting a bit worn, then we can upgrade him or put him onto another hard disk or whatever. It's based on two mistakes. One is the assumption that consciousness is essentially information, and the other is that as you get more powerful computers, they will become conscious. And first of all, consciousness is not information. Information is a rather higher level of consciousness. It's sort of a cognitive level. And the other is that there is no evidence at all that increasing the power of computers brings them any nearer to being conscious. So a super cray with billions of gigabytes of RAM is no more conscious than my pocket calculator. We do, of course, tend to describe what computers and other artificial, inverted commas, intelligence instruments do. We describe it in basically, we personify them. So we talk about the extraordinary capacity of AlphaGo to play Go and to solve the problem of the combinatorial explosion of dealing with the appropriate moves. So that device can beat the world's champion at Go. We know that DeepMind beat Garry Kasparov at chess and so on. But of course, it wasn't playing chess. It was a device that was being used by someone in order to play chess against Garry Kasparov. So we always forget that computers are not in themselves conscious. Any consciousness they ever have is owing to the end user. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think it's unlikely. I mean, a lot of people are sick of Raymond Tallis, but I can't get enough of him. But nonetheless, I think it's unlikely we'll be able to replicate him on a hard disk and then continue to replicate him throughout eternity.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're not quite sick of you.
I beg your pardon?
We're not quite sick of you yet.
Well, thank you for that.
So I'm gonna take the last question here to wrap this up, if I may. So, I mean, the reason that we've invited you to this Center for Humanity Common Good is because all three of us, and the mandate of the center is to try to defend the human person and try to, or I should say, mainly to stave off or to criticize reductive accounts of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
So here we are. We have a professor of philosophy. We have a medical man, a philosopher. I'm philosophical theologian into theology. So given all the stuff that we've said, given the books that you've written, your defense of a human person, like what would you say to us? What would you identify as a first step for igniting in our students a richer, more realistic view of what it means to be human? Like how should we go about that? Write the curriculum for us, right?
Absolutely. Well, I would be one with Wittgenstein, who said, don't think, look. That's not quite right, because in many ways our looking is always informed by thinking. But certainly reflecting on just what happens in ordinary everyday life, the sheer overwhelming complexity of, if you look at it hard, it is magical and mysterious. So the very notion that we can turn exhaled air into poetry. Wow, how do we do that? All of the things that we get up to in everyday life, which, as you look at them, become more and more complex and mysterious. The huge hinterland that is drawn upon in any casual comment. So I think it's about looking at our bottomless complexity. Yeah. Paying attention, and And it's so important to pay attention, isn't it, and to look outside of oneself. I think it's Simone Weil, I think we were talking about it earlier on. She said attention is the purest gift, but actually it's a gift to oneself as well. By attending to what is around one, one turns the given into a gift.
But I know what Bob means, right? What he means is that our ability to pay attention has been technologically stifled. I mean, that's usually your point, right? Yeah. So what's the remedy against that? Like the
attenuation of consciousness.
Yes.
You know, that electronic attenuation. I don't know. I think I said to update the question: what went you into the desert to see? And the answer is, I went into the desert to escape my mobile phone. You know.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ray, for coming out. It's a delight. Thank you, Bob, for joining us for this conversation.
It's been a great pleasure.
We hope it's been of benefit to our audience, and we'll end it here with thanks to you.
Oh well, thank you both very much indeed. Yeah.